evening, everyone, and welcome to Black Literature, Black History. This is Jason Williams, and tonight we're going to continue with Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs, and we're going to get into chapter 2 of this book. Now, in the chapter 2 begins with Harriet Jacobs talking about she was sent to a new master and new mistress upon the death of her former mistress. And in the first paragraph, she speaks again of her father. And this paragraph was a very telling paragraph because in this paragraph, there was an instance when the mistress called for Harriet Jacobs' brother to do a chore for her. And at the very same time, Harriet Jacobs' father called upon the boy, and his name was William. Harriet Jacobs' brother was called William. And in this instance, the boy chose to go to his mistress first. And then when he went to his father told him, and I want to just quote it, it said, "One day when his father and his mistress both happened to call him at the same time, he hesitated between the two, being perplexed to know which had the strongest claim upon his obedience. He finally concluded to go to his mistress. When my father reproved him for it, he said, 'You both called me and I didn't know which I ought to go to first.' 'You are my child,' replied our father, 'and when I call you, you should come immediately, if you have to pass through fire and water.'" So his father told him, "You're to come to me if I call you, if you have to pass through fire and water," which Harriet Jacobs is showing that in her family structure, her father was the stronghold of the family. He was in charge, and he wanted his children to know that he was the man who they are to be obedient to first, and then the master and the mistress. So Harriet Jacobs again begins a chapter speaking of her father. Now, in comparing this slave narrative again to Frederick Douglass spoke most about the physical hardships and the physical suffering and the whippings, and he spoke of the blood, and he painted horrid pictures of what happened on the slave plantation. Now, Harriet Jacobs, she didn't have the same physical experiences as Frederick Douglass. However, she did witness horrid events. And in the second chapter, she speaks about one of the first horrid events that she experienced, where she listened to a slave getting whipped over 100 times. And then later she goes into the room and sees the blood dripping from the cowhide. But Harriet Jacobs goes more into the psychological and the emotional hardships that slaves had to pass through, with broken promises and rules and regulations about like actually what happens when slave masters were pursuing slave women. It wasn't always just an instance of rape. It was rape, but it was not always just a forcible type of rape. And we'll get into that later in later chapters, where Harriet Jacobs herself is being pursued by her slave master. Because actually, these slave masters, they used their position of power and they didn't always want to rape the slave women. They actually wanted to use their position of power to intimidate the women and ultimately have the women surrender themselves to the slave master. And that instance happened with this slave where she says he got whipped over 100 times because he was arguing with his wife. This slave was arguing with his wife because she bore a light-skinned child, and he argued with her about that child being the child of the slave master because it was light-skinned. And when the slave master and white people on the plantation overheard their arguments, it was against the rules for a slave to accuse a slave master of bearing a child with a slave woman. And it was against the rules for the slave woman to tell other slaves that she had a child by the master. And I'm skipping because this happened towards the end of the chapter, but it actually says right here that when the woman pleaded at the after the man got whipped and argued with his wife about the slave master being the father of the child, and I mentioned in earlier segments when we talked about Frederick Douglass how many times a mixed child had it terrible because he was a constant reminder, he or she was a constant reminder of the slave master's adulterous ways, that they were sold off the plantation, and that actually occurs here. And when this slave, actually it was Dr. Flint, which is Harriet Jacobs' new master. He bought this slave, and then he eventually sold him to a slave trader. And this is what the woman said. When the mother was delivered into the trader's hands, she said, "You promised to treat me well." To which he replied, "You have let your tongue run too far, damn you." She had forgotten that it was a crime for a slave to tell who was the father of her child. So, that's an instance of Harriet Jacobs talking about the emotional trauma that the slaves suffered. Just telling someone who the father of your child is can cause you to get all promises broken and sold off to a slave trader. Now, as far as promises goes, this chapter is full of broken promises. The $300 that Harriet Jacobs' grandmother loaned to the mistress. Upon the mistress's death, the estate was passed on to a Dr. Flint, which was Harriet Jacobs' new master, and her grandmother's new master, which was the son-in-law of the mistress, because women didn't inherit property, not the daughter, the son-in-law. And Harriet Jacobs' grandmother went to him and said, "The mistress owes me $300. Can I get my $300? And of course, he said, no, the state, he gave some excuse saying that the state didn't have the money, so she didn't get her $300. But to add insult to injury, upon the grandmother's mistress's death, in her will, she promised to free the grandmother. Just like in the slave papers that I read about my family, when the master died, he said, in my family's papers, it actually said after 3 years of good behavior after the death, Jack should be freed. But in this will, the mistress said upon her death, because of good service, she wanted the grandmother, Harriet Jacobs' grandmother, to be freed. And Dr. Flint, the son-in-law, did not honor that will. So slaves didn't even have, like when it came to slaves, they even broke wills that the former slave masters had. They just did not want to free the slaves. And so upon the death of the mistress and Dr. Flint saying, you know, I'm not going to free you, he put her up for auction. Now they had different types of auctions for slaves. They had private auctions and public auctions. And on the public auctions is when the slaves would stand on the blocks and get auctioned off like a piece of property. Now everyone knew this grandmother because she was very famous and people actually honored her in that community, and they knew that she was supposed to be freed upon the mistress's death. Now, even though the son-in-law didn't honor it, the people in the community wanted to honor it. So, he knew this, so he told the grandmother, well, I'm not going to put you through the stress of having a public auction because I respect you. We'll do it privately. But the grandmother, she knew the community and she was proud. She rebelled against that. And when the public auction began, she went up and she stood on the block. And the community was in awe because they knew that she was supposed to be free. So what happened in this auction, you know, one of the elder white women in the community who couldn't read or write, she put up a bid for the grandmother for $50. No one else in the community counter bidded. So when they sold the grandmother to this woman for $50, she put an X on for her name, and then she freed the grandmother. So this kind of shows that in these communities, like there was some slaves did earn the respect of their community, and the grandmother earned her freedom. However, in this chapter, Harriet Jacobs talks about discussions that she has with her brother William. And the discussion of freedom comes up. But before I get into that, some more emotional trauma that she talks about. While Harriet Jacobs was attending one funeral, she got pulled aside by her grandmother. And this is where it gets kind of confusing when I'm giving these lectures, is because in the book, like, she went under the pen name Linda Brent. So in the book it says her grandmother pulled her aside and said, Linda, I have to tell you something. And she told Harriet Jacobs that her father died. And the slave master and mistress did not allow Harriet Jacobs to attend her father's funeral, did not let her around the grave for a while. And Harriet Jacobs said that the reason why they didn't want her to honor her father was because she felt that through her father, he instilled in her the will to be free, because he was a skilled laborer. And as I said in the first chapter, he told his children, that they were to be obedient to him first, the master second. So they didn't respect that. So they didn't want Harriet Jacobs to honor her father or her brother to honor their father, because he instilled in them the will to be free. And as I stated in the first chapter, he was working his whole life to try to make enough money to purchase the freedom of his children, which he never succeeded. So using that as a segue into her conversations with her brother, William, about freedom, William complains. And he's like, we're never going to be free. And he has more of a realistic view, in my opinion, of freedom, because Harriet Jacobs told him, well, we're going to grow up, we're going to be strong, and we can work and we can buy our freedom. And she said William had no intention to buy his freedom. This is foreshadowing the intent that when he gets older and stronger, he's going to attempt to run and gain his freedom. He's not going to put his faith in money to buy, because his grandmother gets cheated, his father obviously got cheated. They didn't honor any wills, they didn't honor any promises. Like the woman that got sold off, that master promised her that he wasn't going to trade her, and he did anyway. So that's the emotional trauma that these slaves go through. And this manifests later into hatred that Harriet Jacobs has for white people and the slave trade, the slave industry. So, and then they speak of food. When you read these slave narratives, it's really important for you to focus on the food that they gave the slaves. Frederick Douglass said that hunger was the worst physical pain that he experienced. And Harriet Jacobs talks, she mentions in each one of these chapters a little bit about food. Now, I wish that there was a bigger discussion about food, because the food that they ate and the amount of food that they ate will give you a realistic vision of what a slave actually was. Because I think that through legends, we have a misconstrued view of what a slave was. Now, Harriet Jacobs talks about this new master and mistress barely gave her any food to eat. Thankfully, her grandmother was free, so she would pass by her grandmother's house every morning before work to get food. Now, the reason why I say the food is important is because, first of all, we do have knowledge that the current soul food that we eat, I don't want to say that we eat because I don't eat soul food, but the soul food that we know about, pig feet, hog maws, and all of these terrible parts of animals, comes from the parts that they used to give to the slaves, because the masters and mistresses would eat the choice portions of the animals that they ate and would throw the rest out to the slaves, and then the slaves would have to skillfully make supposedly good dishes out of this. But even today, soul food gives us bad health. Back then, they still had bad health. So with the horrible portions of the animals that the slaves used to eat, the scanty amounts of food, many of the slaves were overworked and malnutrition. So this vision that we have of slaves being big, strong, strong as not people, is not true. Many of the slaves were malnourished, overworked, skinny, not big and strong slaves. Now, some of the slaves, for certain purposes, were well fed and big and strong, but for the most part, the slaves were not the strongest people on the plantation. So we need to understand what a slave actually was. And Frederick Douglass talks about his suffering as a slave, but he does talk about the time he got in a scuffle with a slave trader, and he won that scuffle. But during that time period, he wasn't talking about being malnourished and underfed. But we just need to understand that the slaves weren't physically superior to their slave masters, because nutrition had a very negative effect on the slaves, no matter how much they worked. And actually, malnutrition plus work makes you even more unhealthy. But they don't focus that much on food because these slave narratives, they did have uh, an agenda, and their agenda was to abolish slavery. So they talked about the physical violence and the emotional, mental violence, the raping, and all of these other incidents that they talked about going hungry, but they didn't talk about nutrition. That wasn't a big subject back then. So what I want to do, I want to read the last page to show how Harriet Jacobs explains different instances of emotional trauma inflicted upon the slaves. And this talks about the death, what happened at the death of a slave girl. From others than the master, persecution also comes in such cases. I once saw a young slave girl dying soon after the birth of a child nearly white. In her agony, she cried out, "O Lord, come and take me." Her mistress stood by and mocked at her like an incarnate fiend. "You suffer, do you?" she exclaimed. "I am glad of it. You deserve it all and more, too." The girl's mother said, "The baby is dead, thank God, and I hope my poor child will soon be in heaven, too." "Heaven," retorted the mistress, "there is no such place for the like of her and her bastard." The poor mother turned away sobbing. Her dying daughter called her feebly, and as she bent over her, I heard her say, "Don't grieve so, mother. God knows all about it, and He will have mercy upon me." Her sufferings afterwards became so intense that her mistress felt unable to stay, but when she left the room, the scornful smile was still on her lips. 7 children called her mother. The poor black woman had but one child, whose eyes she saw closing in death, while she thanked God for taking her away from the greater bitterness of life. So, like, that's the way that Harriet Jacobs explains how things go on the slave plantation. And she doesn't give, you know, like, she keeps it real. Like, she says that the mistress felt unable to stay because of the sufferings. But she didn't let her off the hook because she said the scornful smile was still on her lips. So Harriet Jacobs, she witnessed things happening on the slave plantation, and she writes very eloquently, and she keeps it real so we can get a very good picture, and we can feel from the words that she conveys, we can feel as much as possible what's going on. Like, there's no way that we can actually get the same feeling without being there, but we know what it feels like to see someone suffering and then their enemy with a scornful smile walking away, taking pleasure in another one's pain. And I really like how Harriet Jacobs doesn't always refer to these slaves as slaves, but black men and black women. And she continues to do that throughout the slave narrative. So, in chapter 2, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, Harriet Jacobs. Please leave some comments. I would really appreciate if people would give comments as you read this book, because I like to go back and forth in the comment section, answer questions, or even gain some enlightenment from what you see in these slave narratives that maybe I haven't seen. Again, this is Jason Williams with Black Literature, Black History. Have a nice evening.